Talk shoes. Recorded live.
Welcome to the Virtualization Security Roundtable podcast, episode number 75. And my script says 33, so we've been doing this for twice as long as the script is old. So there we go. Eben Rodriguez is joining us today, who, Eben, you work for eBay doing what these days?
Cloud Security Infrastructure Architect.
There we go. You need to send me an updated bio.
All right.
Also joining us from Catbird today is Malcolm Reiki, who's the Director of Security Engineering at Catbird. He'll be on the phone shortly, and hopefully I pronounced his name properly. Myself, and I'm Edward Hletke, a.k.a. TechSciWill in the VMware Communities Forum, author of the book VMware vSphere and Virtual Infrastructure Security, Securing the Virtual Environment, as well as VMware ESX and ESXi in the Enterprise, second edition of my first virtualization book. Our podcasts are equalized by Tim Pearson, a contributing author for my security book and owner of Data Century Inc. Our special guest panelist this week is George. George, how do you pronounce your last name?
It's Grillkåta.
George Grillkåta, who's the Director of VMware Center for Policy and Compliance. He brings 17 years of information technology and systems management expertise to the application of IT processes and disciplines that impact security, compliance, and operational status of very complex environments. So welcome, George.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I know it's a mouthful, just like the last name is, but I'm really excited to be here, and it's one of those subjects that I'm passionate about. So it's awesome. Thank you.
So last week, 2 weeks ago, Phil Cox was on with us, ExecProf, on Twitter. We were discussing about the fact that the cloud is actually better than, security-wise, is better than you think. I took a kind of a dim view of that because it may be better, but I can't see it. That's my whole thing. Could be better, I don't know. But you were on a VMware Communities podcast with me. This was last year, middle of the year, I think, and you mentioned something that kind of threw me for a loop. And you mentioned saying that the cloud is secure. It's more secure than you could think of. And I took exception to that because, again, I can't see it to prove it one way or the other. So we've had this conversation going back and forth for a little bit about that, but nothing really there. So we're going to talk about cloud and policy compliance and why you think it's more secure than people realize. Kind of a continuation of last week's podcast to a certain extent 2 weeks ago podcast for our listeners. But it's still an interesting concept.
Yeah, I like it. I think, the one that we did, we were specifically talking about virtualization, but if you start looking at it, I think the concerns around security and compliance are almost one and the same. The reason why people don't completely virtualized mission-critical applications usually comes down to security and compliance. I just don't trust it yet. The reason why I don't move highly regulated workloads out to a cloud environment, well, pretty much the same thing. I just don't trust it yet. But I think in some scenarios, especially when it comes to virtualization, it can be much more secure. And one of the examples, that I blogged on right after our call, because it was great. I thought it was fantastic when you took exception to it and we kind of argued about it a little bit, is around OVF. An open virtualization format. So there have been situations before, we all come from, scan-based technologies with security tools. And the reality is if I'm in a physical environment, so let's say a purely physical environment, and I want to run a scan, let's say, to see which machines were patched and what their AD may be across those machines, how updated that signature file is, how much information can I get off of a physical machine that's turned off? Well, the answer is none, and that's something that's really been harmful throughout the years being in an industry. If you look at things like SQL Slammer, things like Configure and everything else, it always seems to be those systems that are offline that all of a sudden come online, in the physical world, which doesn't happen as much, but when we're talking Windows, it really does. You have a tendency to reboot machines or have machines shut off for a while, except for when they do specific tasks. So all of a sudden they come on.
Let's interrupt that a little bit here. And I've thought that problem's been solved for at least 3 years now, maybe 4, with offline scanning that almost every company that I know of does scanning has.
Yeah, well, you need to dig into that a little bit. So how are they going to do offline scanning on a machine that's off? Are you talking about moving it into a NAP/NAC scenario once it does come online?
Are you talking about physical machine, Ed, or are you talking about virtual machine?
Yeah,
virtual.
exactly.
We're not talking physical here at all. We don't talk physical. We talk virtual on this podcast. But from a virtual perspective,
hold on. He was talking about cloud, not virtualization. So cloud does not mean virtualization. Let's just get that out.
That's exactly right. I agree. So you have to look at physical.
The original conversation was actually about a virtual environment, and that problem's been solved in a virtual environment for 4+ years now.
Right. And that's true. But when you're looking at cloud, it's a different thing. And that's why I was kind of going back to virtual. So the statement that I had made originally was, I believe virtual environments in some instances can be more secure than physical environments. But when we're talking about cloud, I don't know if I can make that statement completely yet. I think that because it is going to have a physical component to it. I have not seen a major provider yet that's moving highly regulated workloads into the cloud that's 100% virtual. I think they'll get there, and obviously I want them to get there because I'm part of VMware, but I haven't seen it yet. I think it's heterogeneous.
I would agree there. I think you've got a lot of people that are still using things like AIX.
Agreed.
And these applications that are effectively too big to fail, that they can't take down. All they can do is add more nodes to make them more powerful, but they can't actually take them down.
Right, exactly. I mean, and that's the exact scenario I was getting at, because there's still going to be that problem with the physical side when you look at it. So because when I'm talking about cloud, now you're bringing in a heterogeneous type environment. And besides just, let's just stick with virtualization for a second in the cloud, it could be multiple virtualization vendors. And I would argue that some do a better job of locking down their hypervisor and that virtual infrastructure than others. Obviously I'm biased from where I come from.
Absolutely would agree with that.
And that's really the name of the game, is it's all starting off with a trusted platform. So if you're starting off with a trusted platform and then you have the right tools and process around it, and we can't forget the process side of things, that's what's going to cause it to lock it down. Now, Ed's statement was a good one around the visibility piece. I don't see it. And that's the problem I have with most cloud providers out there today. So I also work for an institute called IONS, which does security research, and I just did this whole analysis on moving, especially healthcare workloads, out to the cloud. The biggest thing I found was that a lot of cloud providers won't expose their logs. Now, if you're not going to show me, the logs of what's taking place in that environment, I'm going to get another provider. It's about as simple as that. I think it's one of those things where you have to start opening up the kimono and exposing things a bit, because as an IT professional or security professional, even if my workloads start moving out to the cloud, I still have stewardship over the data and who's accessing that data and what's taking place. And I can't just take your word for it. I'm not going to do it. At this point, just like any other IT shop, just like an internal private cloud, I still have to see and get validation, evidence-based proof as to what's taking place within that environment.
That's the whole issue. I did a presentation at Hacker Halted on pen testing the cloud, and there are certain vendors that will allow you to do a pen test. Some of them make you jump through all these hoops, fill out all these forms to actually judge your security for yourself. And I think that's really where you're going to have to take the control yourself to find out what's secure, what's not secure. You can't just rely on the word of the cloud vendor to say, hey, I'm secure, because everyone's going to say that.
Yeah. We discussed this during the last roundtable, in that jurisdiction for security operations and assurance is blurred in a cloud when you've got a cloud customer administrators plus cloud administrators essentially sharing that responsibility. And it's difficult for, I think, the cloud vendor to separate the events that are related to one cloud customer and another, and developing the tools that help you manage both the controls on a per customer basis and and managing the event stream on a per customer basis is really what we need.
To Edward's point, we're not there yet.
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet. I really don't. And I think the better way to look at things is what's going to start transpiring in the cloud as far as things like mixed mode levels of trust, getting some exposure as to what's happening there. And is that more secure? Do we trust the idea that we can put different systems in a multi-tenant environment that have different levels of trust and they are segmented and protected? That's where things start becoming interesting, and I think that's where we're going to start getting some of this evidence-based analysis that's going to start leading to whether the cloud is really secure or not, and who is securing their cloud or not. I mean, if I just look at PCI in general.
Explain what you mean by evidence-based analysis. I mean, the only evidence that we really can get right now that I know of is breach data.
Sure. Breach data, logs, proof. So having proof.
The only time we get breach data and logs and things like that is when it ends up going to when it starts going out into the news, because a lot of people if it's not a headline, we may never actually ever see it as an issue.
Yeah, agreed. But what happens now is, let's say I'm a QSA and I want to perform a ROC.
There we go.
I want to perform a ROC in a cloud type environment. I need evidence. Well, wait a minute. I think that's a strong statement. Why can't I?
You can it depends on who hired you. Let's just say that. And this actually gets down to the whole question about, a lot of people, I actually have known companies, cloud providers now say, we're PCI compliant or whatnot. And quite frankly, I still don't know what that means inside of their environment. What's in scope, what's not. But let's say the QSA is hired by the tenant, right? The QSA, I'm 100% in the cloud. Let's just start with that whole thing. I got a handheld, I got a laptop, I got my phone, and I access everything in the cloud. And my whole company does that. Let's just use that as the base tenant. Let's go to the extreme. I have to hire a QSA because I do PCI work even though it's in the cloud. I get one. He'll be able to look at what the provider will show him, right? Will he be able to look at what the provider does underneath that? And in VMware's terminology, we'll be able to look at the provider's VDC. vCloud, will he be able to look at the provider's vCloud domain?
It depends on what you originally started with. What's going to be in scope? Because again, let's remember with PCI,
the problem is defining scope.
It is the problem is defining scope. But if you have the right QSA, okay, and regardless of who it is that's paying him, the right QSA from the right firm, which by the way has the right technical understanding of what's taking place, because that's a big piece of it. They're going to help define what that scope is. Even if the consumer exposes and says, this is what we believe in scope, this is what you want you to check, well, that leads to the next question. Why am I not checking this other part of the VDC or a VDC that's tied back into it?
Well, let's talk about the legal issues.
Whoever that is, you're breaking up.
Let's talk about the technical aspect.
Probably going to need to type in your response.
Even you're going to have to type in, you're really breaking up.
Okay. And then Edward can repeat it.
I'm sorry. You sound like bubbling water. So when we start thinking about what's in scope for things like that, and this is a question I get all the time, it's like, how do you know? And the thing is that if your data is going to be traveling over that wire, virtual or otherwise, that wire and what it connects to is pretty much in scope. So that means that if I'm a 100% virtualized or 100% cloud, while my environment is in scope, that is in the cloud, so is the cloud provider's environment in scope, up until the point where the data is traveling along that virtual and physical wires. Anything that doesn't touch won't be in scope. But it still means the underlying cloud could very well be, and the underlying hardware very much will be.
That's the key piece, right? Is understanding where that stops. So the way that we like to look at it, and obviously we have QSAs as consultant on staff, and we work with a lot of QSAs right now, especially going into 2012, to further educate them on some of the things you can do at the virtualization layer to really start attacking PCI, especially in mixed mode levels of trust. Is not only is where is that data residing, but what systems are talking to those systems where the data is at, because that also has to be in scope. Because from a QSA perspective, my responsibility to the consumer should also be reducing scope, reducing cost. Because most of the time, whatever I have in scope, in most instances, if it's larger, it's going to be more expensive. Now, sometimes I've seen some shops just say, let's go ahead and put almost everything I have in scope because we're just that bound by PCI or regulated type environments, but that's rare. But one of the things that you have to be able to do then as a consumer and provider is, my data resides in these systems, in this VDC. Who else is talking to these systems? Because those need to be in scope as well. And that's, I think, the biggest piece that a lot of the audit firms today are missing is, how do I understand that and how do I look for that? So, which kind of validates your point, but at the same time, if I get a QSA in there that's very savvy when it comes to virtualization and what's happening with cloud-type technology, they're going to dig, and I've seen it happen. They are going to start digging into those environments and start saying, wait a minute, these other guys need to be in scope too, or you're going to have to do something about the connection between those two systems to segment that environment off from the rest of the not non-trusted, but lower levels of trust systems out there.
Oh, I would agree with you there, and that's where the problem starts, is because once a QSA says, okay, that cloud provider is now in scope, or at least this part of it is in scope, say we know we're using a particular technology, whatever it is, getting the information, the QSA being able to get that information to measure trust, to measure the scope of it in the policy and compliance becomes a nightmare because there is no visibility. I mean, for example, if I'm running a business on Amazon, the chances of me being able to audit Amazon, or at least my part that I'm touching, is pretty much nil.
Agreed.
And if I'm running in some of the bigger clouds, like Amazon
has
the Paramarks and so forth.
Amazon.
Again, it's probably nil unless I built it into my contract. And if I did that, I also spent a huge amount of money to do it.
Amazon has a process for you to pen test your particular cloud that you purchased.
Yes, but that's your cloud, not the underlying everything else.
And that they want to know what you're going to use. They want to know when you're going to do it. They'll give you a window. They're going to want to know how much bandwidth it's going to regard, and they will shut you down if it goes over that.
Yep. And as Mike Foley said on chat, if they don't share, then you have to trust. And it's a bit of a conundrum, and that's true, is that, I mean, can we trust that they're going to be doing everything right?
And I would say, honestly, I mean, I got to say it. I don't think I could. I mean, I really honestly do not think I could, and that's why I would have to start looking at alternatives. And I think that this is going to be what transpires, and we should talk about this because I'm sure there's going to be differences.
Explain what you mean by alternatives. Let's start there.
Okay, so alternatives to who the provider is.
Okay.
Because I believe that people are going to start differentiating. Right now it's all about cost, right? I'm moving out to the cloud because of cost. Well, that's an effective way to start building out a business case. But the next thing that's going to come out is, okay, so is it really cost effective once I start getting those PCI workloads, HIPAA high-tech type workloads out into the cloud type environment? Is it really cost effective then? Because if you really look at what they're offering out of the box, basic packages, it does not cover that in most instances. It really doesn't. So now we're talking about customization, add-ons, support around it. I believe that a lot of providers are going to start differentiating themselves based upon security and compliance type packages and what they're doing around the cloud. I mean, a great example of that, openly, I mean, you guys are all involved with CSA in one form or another, is what CSC is doing around Cloud Trust Protocol. It's not all the way there yet, but there's a lot of things that they're starting to implement and put in place to make it cost effective to move workloads and then provide certain levels of trust.
Okay.
And open it up visibly.
Let's take that a little bit further. Even, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah,
absolutely. Sound awesome.
So assuming that we got that perfect setup and they've done all their homework and the customer is in the right cloud provider, your company is training the QSAs on what to look for to limit scope and to ensure that the protections are all in place. What events and logs would need to be looked at to pass a successful audit? And can we get some of those from cloud providers today, or do we have to generate those ourselves as a customer?
Well, in most instances, a lot of it has to do with identity and access control. So who's accessing what, who's talking to what, within the log environment. And I think the second part of your question is the most important one, which is, do I have to go out there and get those to myself, or is it going to be provided back to me? What we've seen, well, not what we've seen as VMware, but what I've seen individually in a lot of the research that I've done is that you have to go out there and really push for what you get back from the provider. There's a few of them out there. I'd say there's probably about 5 that are out there now actively exposing their logs. And again, you got to kind of shape that, right? Logs are a very big thing. What is it that I want to see and what is it I need to see? So you have to kind of shape that with your QSA back from the provider itself. But there are about 5 to 6, and some of them are non-VMware cloud providers that will expose those logs back to you, but you have to kind of shape what that's going to be. And then we're starting to come up with a list based upon what those regulated workloads are as to what those logs are that you should get back. Just some basic ones to start off with.
You're the one who's ultimately at risk here, because if the cloud provider doesn't provide it, some incident happens, the compliance organization is going to come back to you. You can't simply blame it back on the cloud. Well, they didn't give me that, or they said it was that way. You just
lose your ability to transact credit card data.
Man, I wish we could hear him because he's saying something about credit cards.
Well, no, that would impact your ability to actually be able to take credit cards, and it will. I mean, effectively, if you get dinged on an audit, or more to the point, you get your name in 2-inch letters in the headlines saying that you were hacked, and you go back and they say, oh, it was the cloud provider said they were safe, and they weren't, you're going to lose your ability to do work. It's going to impact the bottom line directly.
So if I can, let me comment on both those things. So starting off on the first one, when it comes to PCI, specifically around credit cards, there's certain things that you should go back to your provider and talk about. The first one is going to be, do you have host-level encryption? What does identity management look like? Endpoint security, log management, can I get access to those logs? Series of questions to go through in the interview process, and are those things exposed to me? The second one is probably the most interesting one, which is the name in the paper, the breach notification, and I specifically look at healthcare for that. Right now, healthcare providers are really, really struggling to take these older applications, legacy applications, get them virtualized, and really start doing things around electronic healthcare records and meaningful use. If you look at meaningful use, there's about 24, 25 different objectives based upon whether you're an organization or ambulance that you have to show around meaningful use. The reason for electronic healthcare records, the reason why that's important is because they get federally funded in a certain amount of money based upon if they're Medicare or Medicaid to show that, but then they also avoid HIPAA high-tech, which shows those security breaches. These guys want to start accessing the cloud for cost savings. If you look at collaborative clouds, if you look at cloud services brokers, those are the paths that they're headed down. But their biggest fear in the world is exactly, I don't know who said it wasn't Ed, but said, hey, once I get that stuff moved out to the cloud, I'm still responsible. So I can't really trust that provider yet because they're going to come back to me if there's a breach on HIPAA high-tech. And then, as Ed said, my name's going to be in the paper. So they have to start asking these series of questions back to the provider, as well as they need to start working with their auditor to ask them a series of questions too. How many rocks have you done, in a cloud-type environment? Does your virtual environment require for you to put everything in scope? Because if they can't answer simple questions like that around virtualization, have you ever segmented in a virtual type environment before? Does a firewall need to be stateful or stateless? What are the scenarios around it? You're not going to be able to qualify the right auditors and the right cloud provider for you to be able to move those workloads with confidence. I know I just said a lot, so I'll shut up for a bit.
No, and that ends up being the big issue, is that we have a lot of people out here that are questioning, hey, is it safe to do this? Mm-hmm. And it really could be. We really could be safe to go into the cloud, but you've got to do it intelligently. You can't just run out and say, okay, I'm going to put everything in the cloud. I'm going to be 100% cloud, whatever. You need to know all this stuff. You need to know your compliance and the compliance that you require. But there's a flip side to that. And this is the other part of what you do, George, is we also need not just compliance, but policy.
Yeah.
I mean, you got to have the right policies in the first place. Just because you virtualize doesn't mean suddenly that things are better.
You're going to need to end up having independent auditors for clouds to say they are doing what they say they're doing. That's going to be the ultimate goal, and that's what's going to move us forward.
Well, I'm thinking different. I'm thinking that for a given workload I want to put into the cloud, I really need the proper policy in place in my organization before I even go to the cloud. I need to know that policy has to address compliance, it has to address data protection, it has to address everything. And then I need my staff 70 to say how well I follow that policy.
That's a given.
Yeah, that's a given, but it's an interesting perspective he has because, what Ed is saying, and I'm actually a believer in, and so some of the guys out there from the audit perspective, K3 Des, Coalfire, they have a deep understanding of this, and they are the people who are now auditing, getting to audit cloud-type environments, especially with PCI 2.0 coming out. But he's right. The policy and the process in front of it should really be the same if you stop and think about it, whether it's physical, whether it's virtual, whether it's cloud. It's the ability to understand the underlying technology, how it works, the dynamic changes within those environments that I think throw a lot of these audit firms off. And then all of a sudden they want to redefine their policies afterwards, and it just doesn't work out. So that's why I believe you have to qualify them. You got to ask them questions about, the infrastructure. What do you do about authentication? Do you restrict admin and root access? How often do you do it? How do you do it? Communication and networking. Is your network segmented properly? Do you provide, leak prevention out there between guest to host and guest to guest, and configuration and patching? How often do you do it? How often do you change your root passwords? I mean, there has to be more of a deeper dive qualification of the cloud provider and of the QSAs up front to really make this whole thing work. But I believe that it can be more secure. We just don't have enough evidence yet, or at least as secure.
And that's the key. It's the evidence that we don't have. I started thinking about this at the last InfoSec World, which is coming up in April, beginning of April again. There's usually a cloud and virtualization security summit. Last year, there was this great guy from Boeing that came in, and they said we did this RFC for, actually an RFQ, request for quote, from cloud providers, but part of that was like a 140 question survey about their security. And it was surprising to them, and they never gave names, but it was surprising to them who didn't fill it out. So, and this is the same thing, is it's not just about security. I mean, security is one thing. Compliance is an entirely different beast. So, what organization...
And walk together.
Well, they need to be married together, yes, but let's think about from a 100% compliance perspective, what cloud out there is going to give me, make a generic, let's say I okay, you need to be PCI compliance, tell me your scope and all this. No cloud's done, maybe one or two clouds have done that so far.
Again, it's going to need to be independently audited to prove that. Because otherwise, that's like having a fat kid.
Wow. That's what I mean by that's why I mean, like, for example, if you say you're PCI compliant, you have to be audited by a PCI organization. The QSA will come in and do it. But the question then becomes scope, right?
Well, yeah, because I want to reduce that scope, and what's in scope, and are you hiding something that should be in scope that's not in scope?
Exactly.
That's really what it starts coming down to, and again, that goes back to the original evidence and visibility, and like I said, I believe that there are providers out there currently doing that today, working on a plan to differentiate with that, and they're going to become the provider of the highly regulated workload, and that's how they're going to pull everything in. Their problem is going to be cost effectiveness, and that's what they're currently working on. How can I make it cost effective to be able to do that for people?
Okay.
But I think it's there. I mean, I think it's starting to get there. It's just taking a while. But right now, reality is that 90% of all providers you go out there, as soon as you ask them, can I just see logs? You give them any of 15 different examples of logs you want to see, they're going to say no. I mean, just immediately the answer is going to be no. And then that's when you know that something's wrong. I don't have the evidence. I'm not going to use that provider. I'm not going to move that workload out there. I'm going to move on and look at the next provider.
I think it's more going to be to the point that they don't have it sanitized to where they can give you only the information that's going to be pertinent to you. I think that's probably the biggest case.
Their event streams are combining data about the security posture, about multiple cloud customers. So we need the tools that allow us to, put all the events that are in scope, all the events that are making a statement about compliance criteria, such that those event streams can be disparate and isolated, and along with the administrative context of the virtualization administration. And that's juxtaposed against what I said earlier, with the same division of labor between the cloud customer administration and then the cloud service provider administration.
And Mike, you had something you wanted to say.
Well, I just wanted to be unmuted so that when I did have something to say, I could say it. But but no, you had made a good point earlier about working out all those security policies long before pushing out to the public cloud. And the issue around log files, as I mentioned in chat, is that log files may reveal stuff that the service provider does not want to be shared, and
would be in breach of another contract if you did it.
Right, and like you had mentioned, what we may end up having is a third party that reviews those on behalf of the tenant who needs them, and says, no, really, you're okay.
Exactly.
And someone needs to.
That's my point.
But the question then is that good enough to take over the responsibility?
So not only do I have the cloud service provider managing my security and my compliance, I have a third-party organization managing whether or not they are compliant.
But the responsibility of the compliance is still on me.
Yeah, exactly. So
right. So
I got other people doing it and verifying that they're doing it right, but eventually it ends up being on my shoulders regardless.
Right.
And all I do is get to go back to this third party that said it was okay and said, but you said it was okay. And he goes, yeah, but it's still your responsibility.
Yeah, thank you, Enron.
Unless you happen to be, this is also logged. So what ends up happening here is that Europe has a totally different law about personal identifiable information. The cloud provider is responsible. So in the U.S., it's not really that case all the time, unless they sign that they are. But in Europe and a few other countries, they are absolutely responsible. A joint responsibility.
Yeah, think about a provider, though. What they're going to do in that case is most of them, again, going back to the cost type issue, they're going to absolve themselves after that. They're going to go after the low-hanging fruit, which is going to be non-highly regulated workloads, and want to consume those instead, because they're not going to want to take that responsibility on in the U.S.
Absolutely,
I don't see it happening. But what I do see, happening, though, is some of these guys are going to get pretty sophisticated around it, and even if they expose, it depends on, so someone asked a great question early on of me, which was, what logs do you want to see? And I think that's probably a really good question that we should dive into a little bit deeper moving forward as we start looking at cloud providers is, these are the logs that I want to see from you, and then that way we know that there's not a conflict ahead of time. Because that is, you're right, you can put a provider in a precarious position if they expose other things through their logs that they obviously don't want anybody to see. And that's probably the major problem with why they don't expose logs today.
Exactly.
I would agree with that. So VMware has some, does anybody else have any questions about this particular topic? Because I do have a kind of a product-y question.
Oh, no, not a product question. Go for it.
Is anybody, we done with that? So,
be a VMware product?
VMware, you guys just announced a new set of tools for monitoring compliance. Perhaps you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So what it is, we're starting to look at this platform that we have, like we mentioned before, the trusted platform, vSphere, and the cloud infrastructure suite that rides on top of it. Part of that cloud infrastructure suite, there's a tool set, one tool in particular, that goes out and runs compliance checks against the host environment and guest environment. And actually, in reality, it does physical as well, too. But for the nature of this conversation, it really focuses on those environments, and it does deep dives against PCI, DISA, SOX, GLBA, HIPAA, looks for non-compliant results, and then remediates those, and then tries to get everything back into a compliant state over time, capturing the changes in between as well, too. Now, this has been leveraged as well, starting to be leveraged by cloud providers to really be able to go out and look at different lines of businesses out there and go and attack the environment and be able to put a lot of those highly regulated workloads in a different structure to be able to do the checkpoints when it comes to things specifically around PCI. I'd say PCI is probably the biggest business generator that tool set has today.
Or using Oval or something like that?
Great question, man. I mean, it sounds like a script for probably the people on the other line. So really, the beginning of it is starting to use SCAP.
Okay.
So and we really believe heavily in SCAP right now. So we talked a little bit before about some of the work around Cloud Trust Protocol, and if you look at Cloud Trust Protocol, really about 6 to 8 of those elements could be done around SCAP. So definitely starting to leverage Security Content Automated Protocol, for those of you who don't know what it is, as part of that. And the reason why that's going to be effective is because it's going to really start automating more that has to do with compliance moving forward, especially when you start looking at what SCAP 1.2 is going to do coming out later on this year from NIST.
Okay. And that product is?
That product is called vCenter Configuration Manager, and it's part of the Security Compliance Suite, so it's very much tied into some of the products that you guys know and are familiar with, like vShield, vEdge, vApp, and Endpoint as well, too.
Okay. And you guys have some one-offs that are kind of based on that, but you don't need the whole suite, the manager, right?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the things that, and this is specifically, so my group writes the content that goes into that product. So we drive the compliance strategy across VMware, but we also write content, and that's why that Oval question was so important, because we're doing a lot of things that, Oval, SCAP this year specifically.
Oval is going to be the standard.
Pardon me?
Oval will be the standard if it's not already the standard.
Right, exactly. So, but the other thing that we're doing, too, is providing free tools out there for assessment for customers. So we have a free compliance checker that goes across ESX, ESXi, that'll do checks across your first 5 hosts within vSphere, and just do a deep analysis on them and say, according to our hardening guidelines, you're good or bad, and this is the reason why we believe that you should have this setting on there. And now we've actually written 2 more around PCI, one for Windows, one for Linux, in guest, obviously, to go out there and leverage PCI analysis as well.
As everyone in the podcast Googles Oval.
Yeah, open vulnerability assessment language, for those of you out there that, they're very tightly coupled.
We had the people from MITRE on talking about their new advancements in that as well late last year.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's fantastic, because the guys at MITRE and NIST just doing great work.
Absolutely. And it's getting better all the time. I mean, SCAP used to be very, very simple and relatively straightforward. You open up a file, you read it, and it makes sense. Now it's actually an incredibly inherited language that the base checks are deep inside when you can inherit from anywhere, which is actually kind of a nice improvement that I can build better things and more things out of that.
Right, you just push a button and, okay, now we want to check PCI compliance. We've got to match these Oval
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And then I get back to system characteristics with it. And one of the things I like too is the output. So all of a sudden I have an output based upon what I get, within a certain tool set of my organization. And I can take that output and consume it in any other SCAP engine I want out there. So it's and when it comes to things like patching as well too. If you look at patch management, same thing with one of the things that we got certified on was the vulnerability assessment and patching piece as well, which we already do patching, but in a very different way. We want to move completely to SCAP to do that, because it's going to really start automating more of the assessment piece up front, and then the verification as to what's taking place on the back end, without having to do a whole lot of rewrites.
Now, does can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay, good. Does it just do reporting, or are you able to, and patching is different than configuration management, so can it make configuration changes to get into compliance?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So right now, everything that we do outside of SCAP is we have full-on remediation for. Everything that we're doing inside of SCAP, we don't have full-on remediation for yet, but it's definitely flagged for the end of the year, because that's something that not a lot of people are doing. So NIST, when we talked to NIST, way back when we started designing a lot of this, they were like, if you guys start doing remediation, automated remediation based upon your SCAP findings, it's going to be a major differentiator, as well as change. Why did that value change the last time I ran this oval assessment?
It sounds like
it change?
Yeah, it's a little bit of overlap with what Tripwire does and maybe what HITRUST does a little bit.
Well, what Tripwire did.
Yeah, well, exactly what Tripwire did.
They're out of that?
Well, we don't see them that much anymore. They were bought by Thoma Bravo, which is an independent firm, and we really don't see them out there as much anymore. I like Tripwire. I was a fan of the tool.
I must have been like a ostrich with my head in the sand. Okay.
No, but I'm a fan of what they did. But in reality, what people are starting to look for, and whoever asked a remediation question is exactly right. So, whenever we did see Tripwire, it was always easy for us to kind of displace them because we could remediate. But what happens now? What was the other one that somebody else mentioned? You mentioned Tripwire and
HITRUST.
HITRUST. So HITRUST, good friends of ours, really good guys. They have different functionality, right? So they don't really do anything SCAP oriented, but the real value they bring to the table, they do a lot of great things, but it's really the authentication piece.
Sure.
So controlling
the
authentication
like
and
there's
change.
a lot of overlap on these products, even with host profiles. There's probably maybe 300 or more different things that you need to configure to pass everything correctly, and people can change those and open up super little holes in the firewall, or enable SSH or whatever you're not supposed to do. And some of it is controlled through host profiles. You can audit or configure. Sounds like your product also does some of that, and then HITRUST does some of that too.
It does, but I think what we're starting to do is really starting to manage the host profiles themselves and do compliance around the profiles. Okay. So that's really where things become a bit different. So
you're going to expand on host profiles, basically. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely, without a doubt. But we're not looking for HITRUST's business. We're very much working with those guys, and it's just a different functionality. There's always going to be overlap, but that's the problem.
HITRUST and Identity Logics provide a different piece of that security puzzle. A necessary piece, but it's different than what VCM does, as well as what a Tripwire would do, and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. And which this leads to, like kind of a parting comment that I have is, and I say this all the time, it's an ecosystem, isn't it? You know what I mean? Like, even though we own the hypervisor, it still takes an ecosystem to make sure that not only the platform, but the workloads on top of it are secure and trusted. So when you have the idea of a trusted cloud, it's not going to be just VMware. It's not going to just be Microsoft or Oracle or whoever it is. It takes a trusted ecosystem of partners and different players to really make sure you have that environment locked down based upon the use case.
So when we talked about that, so I'm going in we mentioned already that, if you don't get the information you want out of your cloud provider, you should just go to someone else.
Yeah.
And you want to do this, go to someone else up front. You don't want to do it. You go through and you finally do your audit, and you're embedded inside of, let's say, cloud provider A. You spent a lot of money with them. Going to someone else then becomes a political problem.
Well, you're exactly right, and that's why it's the upfront work, and I think people miss out on this all the time. They get all excited about cloud, and their CIOs telling them about cloud and the cost savings. So they go out there and they make this switch, and they have a couple wins under the belt, because that's what they always tell you, move dev, QA stuff, whatever it is out there, and then all of a sudden, I get down to the highly regulated workload, and I'm screwed.
Then the security guy finds
exactly.
Out. Yeah, and everything gets pulled back.
Yeah, exactly. So do your work up front. I guess that's the main thing I have to say. But besides, secure, compliant, physical, virtual cloud, do your work up front, especially when it comes to moving those workloads. What is it that you really intend to move down the line, and then do your work up front and come up with that qualification list, that as to what it's going to take to really get there. And I think it's going to be a much simpler task than you believe, and you'll be able to qualify these guys in and out pretty quickly.
I don't agree with that, and you need to.
I don't agree.
And the thing is you also need to know who to ask in these providers. There's a lot of. You can also. If it's available. And this is something I would love for vCloud, VCM to provide, or a vCloud director to provide, is actually provide me the cloud audit framework so that I can tie it directly into a well-known, well-talked about environment.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned. I love it. Stay tuned.
And that, I mean, cloud audit is really where this is going to go. I mean, it was Christopher Hoff's baby. He's still dealing with it, and this is a big thing. But there's only one or two cloud providers even using it right now.
He's still screaming about that.
Yep. Yeah, no, and he will for a while.
But that's really what it comes down to.
It needs to be fully adopted, and that cloud audit would give you visibility. But on top of that, what it would also give you is verification because of who they could open it up to. Those third parties could do the analysis, and then the QSAs can compare against the cloud audit data.
You have tools like Catbird that'll give you visibility right now. Is that the visibility you're talking about?
No. Visibility in the compliance data. Catbird will only give it to you if the cloud provider has Catbird and they've released that to you. Now, Malcolm, you can probably speak more about that, but if you can't see the Catbird dashboards or get a picture of what Catbird's doing, you're never going to be able to see that data.
Your own Catbird in your own cloud.
Well, yeah, you own everything 100%. That's not a problem. We're talking about the public cloud providers here.
Yeah, we have the capability of allowing the cloud customer to have their own portal and access, so they can see it. But like I was saying earlier, very early in the call, it's all a matter of how much of the security administration is divided between the cloud customer administrator and the cloud administrator, and it really requires input from both for compliance, I believe. And it's difficult to separate, what events the cloud administrator does that impacts one or more clients. Separating those things together is really the hard part. We do definitely offer a lot of light onto that, especially on the networking side with the IDS, vulnerability management from a network perspective.
Right.
Okay.
So are you selling this to a lot of cloud service providers, Malcolm? I mean, are they? Is this popular?
Yes.
Okay. And then they could provide just simply access to your portal and, hey, let me look at my flows, let me look at my information, and then have it completely segmented from someone else's.
But you just mentioned the key thing. They have to give you access to that portal.
Well, they would have to. They'd have to create an account, which you can create sub-accounts in that. But I know this is not a podcast about products, but I just wanted to.
And that's the key. That's been the problem all along. Is that the cloud provider has to give you that visibility into whatever tool it is. Whatever you're looking at, that visibility has to exist. And if that visibility doesn't exist, there's no way I can know whether or not everything's been done to a standard. And not only, I think it also boils down, and George, correct me if I'm wrong, is the cloud provider has to give me the scope of their analysis. Because without that, I don't think you have anything.
Yeah. I mean, it's the customer that gets audited, right?
Yeah.
So by outsourcing their IT infrastructure to cloud, they're making a decision that they're putting into a data center that, is somewhat outside of their control administratively and architecturally. The thing is, and the theme of this whole conversation is, what can the cloud provider provide to provide that assurance of the controls that are required by the compliance framework are in place?
That's my whole point.
And there's a lot of solutions coming out, and I think we're going in the right direction.
If they can provide some kind of a independent auditing or generated file of some kind that says we're encrypting our data, we're doing the necessary things that we need to do for PCI compliance, for HIPAA compliance, or whatever, then we're well on our way to solving this problem.
What I find interesting in talking with customers is that when you ask them how many are concerned about compliance and everything else and security in the cloud, every hand goes up.
Of course.
You ask, how many are using the cloud? Some go up. Out of those folks that are using the cloud, when are you planning to use to put your compliance workloads in the cloud? 1 year, one or two hands. 3 years, half the room.
Really?
5 years, the room. You know.
And then you ask them how many people have an iPhone or a device like that, and you wonder why they didn't say they were using the cloud.
Well, that's a bit of a distraction, but the point is that everyone's thinking about it. Very few people are actually doing it.
And there are early adopters out there that are doing it, but those early adopters, some of them have just leaped wholeheartedly into it, and others are still. I mean, a lot of them did a lot of upfront work. I mean, I think that's the key.
Domino's Pizza has, say, 5,000 stores. Each of them buys a cloud link to a particular portal, and each of them have to be PCI compliant, or their bank is going to shut them off from being able to take credit cards. I mean, that's the whole case in point here. So a good case for the cloud where they could basically just use some dumb terminal at their organization, you know, at the place where they're making the pizza. They don't have to have any kind of a secure, high-powered thing, and they don't even have to have anything that's high-powered back at the home office, you know, depending on whether it's franchised or whatever. I mean, the cloud's going to solve a lot of problems if we can get security, if we can get our head around the security and get it fixed.
Well, in that particular case, what you'll find is a lot of folks working with companies like First Data, that the data, once the card is swiped, it's tokenized, and the retailer doesn't even hold the credit card.
Okay. So basically, the credit card goes to First Data, and First Data handles the secure connection and the PCI compliance.
And sends you back a bunch of gobbledygook that says, here's the credit card.
Gotcha.
And it's all tokenized, and you can't see it. No one could get information, and that is definitely one way to do it.
Mm-hmm. And so they're acting as a clearinghouse, if you will, for a credit card, but just PCI compliance. Yep.
Absolutely.
So it's technologies like that that are going to really enable the cloud, and a lot of the I'm afraid that sometimes we tend to look at the way things are and apply them to the things that will be, when in fact that there's going to be a fair amount of other things along the way, that when we get to where secure cloud is a big concern, a lot of technologies like tokenization will alleviate a lot of the pain we have today. And
I concur with that.
And make it easier to adopt cloud.
I'll buy that.
So George had to drop off because he had another thing to go to. I'd like to thank him for joining us. I mean, a couple of things that I think we need to get out of this, and we'll start with Malcolm. Do you have any last words?
Just to summarize what I heard today on the call, it's like people want to know what events they need. I think that the compliance frameworks tell us, you know, what controls need to be in place. So therefore, any events related to the application or the changing of those controls are what we need. In some ways, it's total visibility in the cloud, with the exception of those events and configuration changes that are dealing with a different customer, unless the compliance event or the event that impacts compliance is about that particular other cloud customer virtualized workload, for instance, coming into the same layer 2 connectivity scope, stuff like that. Otherwise, I mean, it's a matter of what we need to do as professionals in security and compliance and product or solution providers is, you know, help, you know, define what those events are in the virtualization technology where we are, and that's what I spend a lot of time doing. I think that it's mapping the compliance frameworks to the relevant events and then making sure we can aggregate those on a per-customer basis.
Malcolm, I think we can safely say that the responsibility and the workload now is on us to do all of this stuff until at some point in time there is some consortium, some third party, some regulatory agency that says they've done it, and we can say, give us the nod, okay, well, they said they did it, we're fine. Otherwise,
so even then, you may. I mean, I think what's come out of this call is even then, you have to trust but verify. You cannot go and say, okay, since agency XYZ says it's all right, therefore I can do it. Those agencies could also be wrong.
I think George summed it up. Ask them the question about what logs you can get. By its very nature, most of compliance is about validating that controls are in place, and that you get that primarily from logs. So if the guy can't give you logs, then you can't be compliant.
Is that Mike speaking?
That's Malcolm.
That was Malcolm.
Okay, Malcolm.
Eben, you have any last words?
Mike, from an RSA perspective, what do you think?
About what specifically?
Well, how does RSA or any of the products that you have perhaps fall into this?
Well, we do have our I don't want to turn it into a product call, but we do have our EGRC solution, RSA Archer, and today we pull some information from vCenter, and we assess the state of things and then can show whether or not things are in compliance with things like PCI or HIPAA or SOX or whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. And I can't go into any further detail on that at this time.
So, Eben, what are your last thoughts?
Yeah, it seems that not having that integration. I mean, there's standards that tell us what we need to look at. Denied login attempts, denied other attempts. But
you're talking about
for compliance, like what reports we need to generate, what logs we need to look at. Right. And then it's not so easy just to say, well, then we should just go get those from the VMware product or the other product, because we need to know where those logs are and at what level of detail. So there should be a configuration guide that basically tells us maybe how to configure Splunk or Archer or one of the, what's the RSA?
RSA Envision.
Envision logging product, some guide that shows you how to configure these logging tools to get the correct data to be PCI compliant or HIPAA compliant. And they each have a different standard of data retention and whatnot. So it'd be nice if there was kind of a cheat sheet to kind of help put it all together, integrate it. That's what I'm looking for.
So you're saying you don't see integration?
Yeah, I mean, you have the vendors saying, well, just read the PCI guide and do what it says, and then you got the PCI guide, somebody's got to put it together. And a lot of that's subject to interpretation, and that's where you fail your audit, is because you don't know how to interpret that, or you would really like to collect those logs, but you're not exactly sure. You need to get it from every ESX host or from vCenter, or now we got this, director. Where are the logs, and what do I do?
Every security and compliance relevant event needs to be tagged somehow with the relevant section in the compliance criteria you're interested in.
So I need a guide to tell me how to do that and show me an example, kind of like a evaluator's guide or a cookbook of some sort.
Yeah, that's going to be very dependent on how the logs are delivered to you.
True.
It's also going to be dependent on
your auditors are they're going to have a checkbox. Is it checked or is it not checked, right?
Yeah,
the auditor, it also depends on the QSA you get, because the type of things like there, it also depends on the business you're doing. Some businesses have different rules and regulations than others, but the way you do your business will dictate what logs you look at as well.
Right, and I think every single person in this podcast has had to educate an auditor about what's secure, what's not secure in a virtual environment. I mean, I know that without even saying.
Yeah, it sounds like we've also interpreted those logs to be relevant to one section or another as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to leave with one other thought, and then we can end the call. Is that, when we were talking to George, scope is actually very important, and we need to know if a provider does say I'm compliant in X, Y, and Z,
what is the scope of that compliancy? Because if you don't know the scope, I mean, I could be looking at log files till I'm blue in the face, but I still need to know what they considered in scope for their compliance.
Right.
And I need to dovetail into what I consider to be in scope for my environment. So it's you have to dovetail both of them. And I thank everybody for joining us. I thank George Gerchild from VMware for joining us. He had to leave early. And everybody have a very good day, and thank you again.
Thanks, Ed.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Ed.
Ed.
I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.